it does look like we are on a track, if we ever actually do get carbon legislation, to have an extraordinarily low price, one that I think will cause no press conferences outside the gas stations. $30 a ton, which seems to be, even that is a difficult price for Congress to accept, would be about 27 cents a gallon at the pump. We see fluctuations like that all the time, and I think it just would draw no attention. It would also cause almost no change. $30 a ton doesn't take coal out of being the most efficient, cost-effective way to produce electricity. If that's your entire climate policy, you continue to make electricity with pulverized coal power plants. It's worse than that, I think, in ways people don't appreciate, which is that the price of fossil fuels right now reflects not just the cost of extracting it, but a scarcity rent associated with the shortage of fossil fuels. This is even true in coal because of the transportation cost for moving coal, but it's clearly true in oil. Everybody understands that most of the oil can be extracted for well under $80 a barrel. The flip side of that is if you really are going to drive those fuels out of the market, which is what you have to do. If we're talking about market mechanisms, you have to make it uneconomic to produce energy with those fossil fuels. Think about what happens if you start using a lot less oil. The price of oil will fall, but if it falls to $40 a barrel, the price of gasoline is going to go down too. That's going to make it much less economic to use alternatives to gasoline. Likewise, if the price of coal falls, or if mine-mouth power plants continue to operate even when coal becomes, our carbon prices go up, you're not driving them out of the market. What that means is that if you really think through the full economics of what it would take in terms of market mechanisms to remove fossil fuels from the system, a price of $30 a ton isn't going to do it, and my guess is a price of $80 a ton isn't going to do it. Because what's going to happen is as the price of carbon goes up, the price of fossil fuels goes down, and they continue to be economic. What the alternatives have to beat is not the current price of fossil fuels. What they have to beat is the true cost of extracting them. That is, you have to be able to make them uneconomic at just the marginal cost of extraction. And fossil fuels are incredibly cheap to extract and burn. So if we're talking about a market mechanism, I think that we need to be thinking about prices that are well in excess of the prices that Congress now talks about. This worries me about cap and trade. It worries me even more about taxes, because once you start talking about taxes and you lock in a number, cap and trade has the flexibility to then change if you're not making progress on reducing carbon. Taxes requires a new act of Congress, literally, to get to a higher tax. So we put in a $30 a ton, $40 a ton, some sort of tax, and we find out it's doing nothing. We, like the EU is now, are shocked to find out that despite the fact we've passed legislation, our greenhouse gas emissions have continued to climb. And then we have to start all over again, and I think it just becomes more and more difficult. Unfortunately, when I've said this to some of my environmental friends, they have not hopefully, but reassuringly told me that it will be easier because there will be more obvious climate disasters by then. You know, that just can't be the right public policy trend, right? We all recognize that we aren't going to single-handedly in California or the US solve this problem. But whatever we do really should be scalable. It doesn't really help to do something that is an idiosyncratic solution in California but really can't be exported anywhere else. And I think that if we're going to go down this route, we really need to think about what aspects of cap and trade are really exportable. Setting good rules is important, but also understanding what these impacts are going to be on world markets is also important. So let me just give you one sort of illustration of that. Say California implements cap and trade. California is a small part of the world energy base. We get to $40 or $50 prices. That seems unlikely, but let's say we did. The price of our gasoline will actually probably go up most of that 40 or 50 cents because it won't drive down the world oil price very much because we're small. Now think about trying to expand that program. What we've done is we've just fooled ourselves into thinking we're actually reducing carbon. But actually what's happened is the price of oil has fallen a tiny bit and the rest of the world has increased their consumption because oil has gotten cheaper. So if we're going to talk about a worldwide program to reduce cap and trade, we have to have a program that actually figures out how to deal with that leakage. So let me make one more sort of point on thinking about this sort of global enforcement. People talk a lot about offsets, and I have made at times disparaging comments about offsets. I'm certainly concerned about them. And gradually my views on this have matured a bit, I think, and I've come to realize it's not offsets that are the problem. It is the incredible scale of the ecosystem that we're talking about. And this was driven home to me in talking to some scientists who pointed out that basically for thousands of years, the world has gone along in roughly greenhouse gas balance, hundreds of thousands of years. And in the last 200 years, we've gotten out of greenhouse gas balance. We've gotten out of it by burning fossil fuels. But if you think of what that's done to the actual ecosystem, we've essentially gotten a few percent out of balance in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of the entire CO2 ecosystem. That includes oceans, that includes trees, that includes people exhaling. Now we're trying to rein that in. If we're going to start thinking about, well, what are all the different ways we could rein it in? We're not talking about the 3% that we've just created. We're talking about the entire 103%. And when you start talking about carbon offsets, you start bringing in things that weren't part of that 3%, like growing more trees, like changing ocean chemistry in ways that I certainly don't understand, but don't sound that obvious to me. Even if you think those things are doable, they require assigning property rights in places we have never assigned property rights. Everybody has had the right to treat CO2 as a free good, to treat greenhouse gas as a free good for that first 100% forever. And for the last 3%, the man-made stuff as well. It's pretty easy to see how to start assigning property rights on the last 3%. If you burn a fossil fuel, we charge you for the carbon emissions. It's much harder to see, and although even that is politically very difficult, it's much harder to see how you deal with the other 100%. How when you start dealing with forests burning down, who owes whom money for that? How you start, if you start paying people to grow forests, what happens if the next forest over gets cut down instead and those people weren't part of the system? When you start thinking through that larger picture, it starts to look like you're going to have to assign property rights to the whole 103%, not just to that last 3%. That's really not viable. You're just not, when you think in general, think about California's water system. Assigning property rights to things that previously have just been treated as common law or free is a political nightmare. Once we go down that road, I think there's just no obvious place to stop. So now that I've given you my upbeat view, let me finish by just saying, I think that this doesn't argue against using cap and trade. In fact, I think it does argue strongly towards using cap and trade, or using some price mechanism, but not by itself. I think that people do have to recognize the true cost of emitting greenhouse gases. We need to get global agreement on that, but we also need to be realistic. And if we're going to do that, we have to recognize that that can't be the only solution. Eventually, we're going to have to, as Peter said, get to a technology that actually can beat carbon on a cost-for-cost basis, or nearly so. And that, I think, argues that besides going down cap and trade or taxes, we need also very much to be pushing much harder on research and development for completely new breakthrough technologies.